Welcome to HuffPost Live. I'm Ryan Grimm. A new book is out, and it argues that under capitalism, the rich get richer. This, quite naturally, has rocked the economics profession to its core. I'm joined here today by the author of that book, Capital in the 21st Century, Thomas Piketty. And to help me digest this, we're joined also by Alexis Goldstein of the other 98%, herself a former Wall Street banker. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you for inviting me.
So let me try real quickly to try to lay out a top line here. You tell me if I'm botching it. You tell me what I'm leaving out. But essentially, what you've done here, that nobody else has done in the past, is combined more than 200 years of empirical data on inequality and deduced a few patterns that are evident in capitalism. And the main one that you find is that returns on capital outstrip returns on growth of the regular economy. And what that means is the rich keep getting richer, everybody else stays below the rich. Capital keeps accumulating to the top. I think you say at one point the past devours the future, because as people inherit more money, they grow more and more power. The more and more power they have, the more they tilt the rules in their favor. Elaborate a little bit on that. What did I get anything wrong here? What did you find?
Okay, so this is one important mechanism, but this is not the only one I find. I should say that, first of all, this book is trying to propose, to write the history of income and wealth, and first of all, this book is trying to put together.
It's quite a book too. It's
yeah, I'm sorry, it's probably too long. But on the other hand, this is putting data on the history of income and wealth is in over 20 countries, over 3 centuries. So if this had been a 100-page book, you would have thought it was too small. So, this
You're
is
forgiven.
Although the book is a single author book, I should say that this is really the outcome of a collective research program where we've been collecting together with Tony Atkinson in the UK, Manuel Saez in Berkeley, Facundo Alvaredo for Argentina, Abhijit Banerjee from India. I started with collecting the historical data for income and wealth in France, and then we've moved to many other countries. And without all these co-authors, there's no way I could have collected all this data. And it's important to stress that because I draw some conclusions about the future and about policy in the part 4 of the book, but I want to stress right away that you don't need to agree with part 4 to find some interest in part 1, 2, and 3. And so most of the book is about the history of income and wealth distribution. And my main objective is to help everybody to write their own part 4 of the book. And even if you disagree with my own conclusion for the future, I think it may be interesting to learn more about the history of these things. This is by far the largest database on the historical evolution of inequality. So, there are different forces going on in every direction. There are some forces that also push for the compression of inequality. Now, you're right to point out that one of the main forces that could push in the direction of rising wealth concentration in the future is the tendency for a rate of return to capital to exceed growth rate in the long run. This is, I think, the central reason why we had so much wealth concentration in the past, in particular in all European countries until World War I. The top 10% of the population will own almost all the wealth, over 90% of the wealth, including 60 or 70% of total wealth for the top 1%. And I think the main explanation for this incredible concentration of wealth was indeed the fact that the rate of return to wealth was like 4 or 5% per year, and the growth rate 1%. Now, in the 20th century, we sort of forgot about this because there was very unusual events that made this different. But in the future, there are reasons to believe that we might return to this inequality between the rate of return and the growth rate.
So may I jump in at this point? What you just said reminds me of a question that I had, which is a lot of people point to this period of time between 1945 and 1973, the so-called golden age, where income of the masses was rising and income inequality was somewhat smaller, as a sort of counterpoint to this idea that capitalism is always going to produce vast inequality. And you mentioned that that's actually not a historical norm, that is probably an exception to the norm, this period of time from 45 to 73. And I was wondering if you could elaborate a little bit on that point.
Okay, so you have in the 20th century, you have the combination of a number of quite unusual events. So the first unusual event is the long sequence of World War I, the Great Depression, World War II, which is a very extreme series of events between 1914 and 1945, with a couple of consequences. The first one is that the return to capital was very low, of course, between 1914 and 1945. You had in fact, huge destruction of capital, particularly in Europe, and even in countries like the UK or the US, where you didn't have much destruction on UK soil, through the financing of the war, through public debt and post-war inflation to get rid of public debt, in effect, there was a lot of destruction of private wealth and very low rate of return. The other implication of the war is that there was little growth between 1940 and 1945, and then you had very fast growth between 1945 and the 1970s, partly because there was a catch-up between many countries in continental Europe, and Japan had to catch up with the US, so you had unusually large growth rate for that reason. The more positive reason why the 20th century was exceptional was the very fast population growth of that period, and the baby boom cohorts and the rise of population. This is important because population growth together with fast productivity growth make the past less important. Make the wealth inequality of the past less important, because when you have if you have a 4% or 5% growth rate, then you have rising income, rising labor income in particular, so you can sort of enter the wealth game even if you start with little or no wealth at all, because this sort of high growth rate equilibrates the high rate of return to capital. But since 1980, we are back to a much lower growth rate, 1 to 2%, and then we are in a different kind of equilibrium.
Now, the reaction to your book in the United States has been a phenomenon. This is a French economics book, which is translated into English. It's on the New York Times bestseller list. What accounts do you think for the success of this book? I think Harvard Press hasn't had a book move copies like this in decades.
Yeah, I don't know. First, this is not a French book. This was written in French because my French is much better than my English, and I apologize for my bad accent. This is really the output of an international research project where scholars from over 20 countries contributed to the collection of data, and that's in this book. And I think the primary reason why for the success of this book is that people have talked about inequality forever. There's always been a lot of political fight about income and wealth inequality, and there will always be. But until recently, there was relatively little data collection. So people will fight, without sometimes knowing what the facts are. So what's really new here, and which I think appeal to people, is that we have first tried to collect data, which economists. I guess this was. Too historical for economists and too economic for historians. So nobody was collecting this historical data on income and wealth. Well, to be fair, also we benefit from the fact that the information technology today, make it possible to collect much bigger quantity of data than was possible in the past. Until the 1980s or even 1990s, people were doing that almost by hand when they would go in the archives, the inheritance archives in France, or the income tax data for the US. When Kuznets wrote in the 1950s, of course, this was almost entirely by hand. So it's much easier today to have all this material, put it online, which is what we do. The database itself is available online, so that I can concentrate on the book and sort of trying to tell a story. Readable story, right. I think, about the political and economic forces that can explain this trend, and so hopefully the book is is readable, and yeah, I don't know. I'm very happy that it seems to.
So can I actually ask you, one of the things that you just mentioned is that no one had really collected this data before. Part of the reason is because of technology, but also, you know, we've been in the last 20 years, we've had the ability to do this, and you're sort of the first one to put it all together like this. Do you think that this is a failing of the economics profession? And specifically, like from my vantage point in the United States, a lot of our economists will make arguments to justify lower taxes or justify deregulation. So I'm curious if you think the economics profession overall needs a course correction.
Well, yeah, I think you're partly right. I think, you know, it's not only technology; it's also ideology that made economists not so interested in income distribution for a long while. You know, I think. There are two problems here. One is with really the economics profession, and too often, you know, economists are trying to look scientific and more scientific than other social sciences by, in fact, using too much complicated math and not going sufficiently after the data and after the historical data. So, you know, when I started as a young assistant professor in a US university, you know, I found it really striking that you know, everybody was expecting me to prove new mathematical theorems, and I realized that, you know, we had very little knowledge of the basic facts on income and wealth distributions, and we wanted to explain. So, you know, math can be useful, but only if it's simple and if it allows you to explain a large number of facts. And if we don't even know what to explain, you know, what's the point of proving theorems? So I think part of it is because it's an easy way to look scientific, you know, and
right.
You know, using a lot of techniques, you know, it's a way to sort of put off other people and try to pretend that what we are doing is very scientific. Now, the other issue, which I think is even more important, and it's not a problem only with economists, it's the fact that for a very long time period, you know, the Cold War made it difficult to have a sort of quiet debate about inequality under capitalism. Well, I think it will always be difficult to have a quiet conversation about such you know, issues. But, you know, during the Cold War period, you know, it's, you know, people really wanted to believe in sort of happy end stories about inequality under capitalism. So, for instance, you know, Kuznets' evidence in the 1950s and 1960s, you know, himself, he did not believe that the reduction of inequalities in the US that he found between 1910 and 1950, he did not believe that this was a natural process. You know, he was very well aware, if you read his book, that, you know, the World War, the Great Depression, and the policies that were implemented after these shocks, progressive taxation and other policies, played a very important role. But, you know, everybody wanted to believe in a sort of natural process that will sort of naturally lead to a decline of inequality in advanced stages of development, because again, in the Cold War context, the fight between you know, capitalism and communism was so great that.
So if you had written your piece then, rather than being compared to Marx, you'd be called. Yeah, you'd be somebody who is trying to help the Soviet Union or undermine capitalism.
You know, maybe, right. And I don't know, you know, what I would have done. You know, I think I am lucky enough, you know, to belong to a generation, and maybe to the first generation, that didn't have to make that kind of choice, because, you know, the Soviet Union was gone, so this was not an option. So it's easier. You know, I turned 18 in 1989, and, you know, I traveled to Eastern Europe after the fall of communist dictatorship, and, you know, I never had any temptation for the, you know, that kind of system. So it's easier in a way for my generation to, I think, reopen this debate without you know, that this big pressure of the Cold War. And
at the same time, do you think that the pressure of the competing ideology, so that capitalists couldn't say, well, this is the only alternative, do you think that pressure created you know, less inequality? In other words, it required a minimum wage. It required more of a social safety net. It required somebody like a Keynes to come up with a way to reduce the severity of crises, because there was an alternative. There no longer is, and at the same time that there's no longer an alternative, you see all the things that were put in place during that time period kind of being whittled away.
Yeah, I think you're perfectly right. I think the existence of a counter model was one of the reasons that made, a number of reform and policies were accepted in France. It's very striking to see that in 1920, the political majorities that adopt steeply progressive income taxation are exactly the same people who refused the income tax in 1914 with a 2% tax rate. And in between, the Bolshevik Revolution sort of made them feel that after all, progressive taxation is not so dangerous as compared to the
communism
revolution.
might have been better for people in capitalist countries than it was for people in communist countries.
Oh yeah, it was certainly better, yes, for people in capitalist countries. And I think conversely, the fall of the Soviet Union, I think opened, around 1990, a new era of, limitless faith in the sort of auto-regulated, self-regulated market, and we started, or many people started to believe that there was, this was the end of history, and markets could do everything on their own. I think markets can do a lot of things, and I am very much in favor of economic openness and globalization. But there are things that market can't do, and in particular, the fact that the rate of return to capital tends to be larger than the growth rate and can be larger than the growth rate forever. This has nothing to do with the market imperfection. It's important to stress that even in the textbook economic model, where you have perfect competition, perfectly competitive markets, a perfect capital market, you will have R bigger than G, the rate of return bigger than the growth rate. And in fact, the more perfect the capital market, in the economist sense, the bigger the rate of return. The whole purpose of a perfect capital market is to allow any individual with a large piece of wealth, no matter how unable he or she is, to get the highest return to capital on the planet. This is the whole purpose of a perfect capital market. So economic rationality, in that sense, can run counter to a sort of democratic rationality or meritocratic rationality. So there's nothing in the market process itself that guarantees that the distribution of income or wealth will be fair or acceptable or desirable in any meaningful sense.
I've heard you talk in interviews about meritocratic extremism, especially among the people that you call super managers. So like the CEOs at the top, or the Saudi prince who has a huge amount of capital, are in competition with each other, and they sort of always want to one-up each other. And one byproduct of that we see in the United States is, people get on people's board of directors and then continuously inflate their own salaries. And I think you could argue at least that there is somewhat of a break from market conditions when it comes to their worth as managers and when it comes to their salary. So I'm curious, do you think that the way CEOs compensate themselves is the market working as designed, or is that a place where there is maybe a break from what the market would truly pay them if they were paid what they were worth?
It's very difficult to explain the huge rise of top managerial compensation with a pure productivity model, because if you look at the US economy over the past 2 or 3 decades, you see rising inequality and rising top managerial compensation everywhere except in the growth statistics. It's not that the growth performance of the US economy or US corporations over the past 2-3 decades are not been terribly good. So it doesn't seem to be worthwhile to have such a large share of such a small growth going to the top 1%. If you compare to the growth of the 50s, 60s, 70s, the growth since 1980, if anything, has been smaller. If you compare to other countries like Germany, Japan, or Sweden, which have gone through the same technological revolution and have had the same productivity growth performance without the same increase in inequality. If you compare the companies the US companies that pay their CEOs $10 million more, you don't see a difference in performance that could justify this. So I think it's a lot of rent extraction, and I think here the steeply progressive income tax at the very top end is probably the right way to calm down the process at the very top end. And I think the huge reduction in top income tax rates that has occurred in the US between the 1960s, 70s, and the 1980s, 90s, 2000 is one of the key explanations as to why the top compensation have increased so much. I think this reduction in top tax rate has changed significantly the incentives of top managers, to put the right people in the compensation committee and to take control of this pay setting process. So, this is clearly an example where, the invisible hand of the market is being replaced by the grabbing hand, or, the real world institutions with compensation committee. But I guess one message of my book is to try to shift the attention somewhat from this issue of top managerial compensation, which is very important, particularly in the US, to another issue, which is the dynamics of wealth inequality and wealth concentration, where the basic economic process is different and has a lot more to do with R bigger than G, the rate of return to wealth bigger than the growth rate, the fact that the top of the wealth distribution, not only in the US but also in Europe and at the world level, has been rising 2 to 3 times as fast as the size of the world economy. And I think in the long run, this is an even more serious problem as the rise of top managerial compensation. And this is a problem that won't go away simply with more competition or better corporate governance or whatever.
Paul Krugman, who reviewed your book and gave it very high praise, did criticize you for this particularly, and I think that in the United States, I bet that we're going to see more of that in the next couple months, of people saying, well, this guy doesn't understand, he's focused so much on inheritance that and other forms of capital, that he doesn't recognize that there's this other threat, or from the right, that there's this other meritocracy that is wages, and that wage inequality is the real issue that he misses. So what would be the response to Krugman in that piece, or for a similar critique coming from the right?
No, I talk a lot about top incomes and top managerial compensation in the US. In fact, I constructed the series with Emmanuel Saez that we use to document this rise. So I will say I'm certainly not going to deny that this is important, but I think we also need to look at the wealth part. I think I think Paul Krugman is right that I should probably have put more emphasis in the book on the importance of financial deregulation. I think finance, of course, is very important in the rise of very top incomes. Although this should not be overestimated. I think finance is about 10% of GDP, and it's about 20% of top 0.1% income holders. So, it's a lot. It's twice as much as the share of finance in GDP. But still, 80% of the top 0.1% income holders are outside finance, and these are top executive in large non-financial corporations. So if we only focus on the finance part of the story, I think we are missing the fact that it's really the pay-setting process for all large corporations in finance and outside finance that has gotten out of control somehow. So this is playing an important part in the book. Now, it is true that the book maybe is not as centered on the US as the US debate tends to be, which I certainly understand. But I think at the world level, what's happening with the wealth distribution and the top of the wealth distribution is actually quite important, and in the US as well. I think the concentration of wealth in the US is rising, the top 10% of the US wealth distribution and the top 1% of the US wealth distribution is getting a rising share of US national wealth, and I think this has become a very big issue in the future. We right now in the US, the bottom 50% of the US population has 2% of national wealth, which is really not so much. So, even if we don't want to go all the way to socialism, maybe we can do better than 2%. Maybe we can find policies to make it to 5%, 8%, I don't know. Right. And the next 40%, so in between the bottom 50 and the top 10, they have about 20-25% of national wealth, and this middle class is actually shrinking. Their share in national wealth is shrinking. So I think I think this is a serious issue, and so the book purposely, is trying to shift the attention from the study of top managerial compensation to the study of wealth dynamics. Both are important. Both are complementary. As we said before, I think both phenomena sort of can feed each other in two ways. First, very large top managerial compensation can give rise at the following generation to large transmission of wealth, and also at a deeper level, I think you have what we were saying before, this race between top managers and top wealth holders is very important, I think, in the political discourse and in the political justification of inequality. It's as if, the top managerial compensation can gain justification from the fact that, the top wealth holders are so rich that if you want some people to catch up with them without initial wealth, then you need to have very top managerial compensation. And I can see the strength of this argument, and at the same time, I can see that for those who lose on both dimensions, who don't have a top labor income and who are not top wealth holders either, then the life can be tough, because they lose on both sides, and on the top of that, they are being described as basically unproductive and undeserving. So I think this new model of inequality that is developing, in particular in the United States, is in many ways, very frightening, and can be even worse than the sort of traditional wealth-based model where, at least in a novel of Jane Austen, nobody will pretend that the servants, are less deserving than the master. They just happen to be servants, and the master happen to be master. But nobody is trying to argue that this is a difference based on merit. So
we're worse than a Jane Austen novel now. It sounds like.
Right, because the reverse tends to be true, that if the top earners are wonderful people, then, well, the people at the bottom must be terrible and not deserving of help.
No, I think this is what the top is trying to pretend, and I can see why they are trying to pretend that, and everybody has to, you have to justify your own position. So, but this puts a very strong pressure on people who happen to be in the bottom and in the middle, and the actual evidence in favor of this claim is quite thin, I would say. As I was saying, the growth performance of the companies paying their managers 10 million instead of 1 doesn't seem to be particularly great. So I think we have to try to look at this evidence, as precisely as we can, and that's the purpose of this book.
So can I ask about one of your solutions, which is essentially levying a global progressive tax on capital, on private property? And I like to compare it to something that we've done, which was also a global exercise, and it came about in the wake of the financial crisis, and it was the Dodd-Frank Act, which was meant to reform Wall Street. Now, granted, this is United States law, but there's been a lot of coordination between the EU and the United States. And usually what happens is the rules get watered down as opposed to get strengthened. But it's, 4 years since the crisis plus, and we still can't get global coordination on how do we, for example, make sure that the riskiest derivatives trade in more transparent ways. And so I'm curious if you think we might have more luck with coordinating something like taxes than we've had with coordinating regulations on Wall Street, or if it's a more difficult fight even than that.
Well, Okay, first let me say that a lot can be done at the national level. So it's better to have a global wealth tax, but you can do a lot at the national level. Especially in large countries like the US or China. For European countries, it's a bit more complicated. But even then, you can do a lot at the national level. So right now, in a country like the US and actually in most European countries, the main wealth tax is the property tax. Okay, so what I would recommend, ideally, would be to transform, existing property tax into a progressive tax on net wealth. So what will be the difference? The difference will be that, the bottom half, or actually the bottom 3/4 of the U.S. population would pay less property tax than they do now, and the upper wealth part will pay more. So in fact, this will increase wealth mobility. This will increase wealth accumulation, and this is something that can be done. So. Let me again explain what will be the difference. Right now, if you own a house that's worth $500,000, but you have a mortgage of $490,000, your net wealth is in fact very small. It's $10,000. So with a progressive tax on net wealth, you would not pay any tax. Whereas with the current property tax, you're paying as much as someone who doesn't have a mortgage, who inherited from his house or who has reimbursed the house a long time ago. And I think this is nonsense, because, when you have a very low net wealth and a huge mortgage, you are paying in interest payment as much as what a tenant will pay in rent, and there's no reason you pay more tax than a tenant. So this can be done. You can transform the property tax into a progressive tax on net wealth. In a country like the US, you can perfectly do that. It's not that people will all fly to Mexico or Canada if you do this. So. In small countries like European countries, you certainly need more coordination. More generally, if you want to get as much progressivity as you want at the very top end of this progressive wealth tax, then indeed you probably need a global registry of financial assets, so that who owns what, at least in the US, EU area, which is already a big part of the world. The US is 1/4 of world GDP, the EU is another 1/4 of world GDP, and these 2 quarters put together make 1/2 of world GDP, and they are supposed to sign a treaty together on transatlantic, trade and investment. We already have free trade, so there's not that much to do in this direction. But I think having better, coordination to fight tax haven will be something to put in this treaty. And what's new here in my book is that I think if we want to make this fight against tax haven work, we have to go all the way to a registry of financial assets. And for this registry to work, I think a minimal registration tax on individual asset holdings is necessary. This is a way also to guarantee your property right in a way. And then, we'll see, what kind of tax rate, come about in the future. But
wait, just to be clear, does that mean that stocks and bonds, for example, which are typically taxed now at the point of sale, would be taxed all throughout the duration that you own them? Is that one thing that you're proposing?
If that was an annual wealth tax, yes, they will be taxed every year. Just like your property, your real estate property is taxed every year with the property tax.
Right.
But that will be automatic. If you have automatic transmission of bank information at the national and international level, you will just make each individual pay an individual-based wealth tax, on the basis of all this information.
I know you have to run soon, but what's been interesting, real quickly, here in the U.S. is that all of the criticism that has been remotely intelligent has come from friendly fire so far. I wanted to get your response just quickly to a couple of those. One of them from the economist Jamie Galbraith, and I am having trouble even making sense of it. So I'd like to do 2 things. One, respond to it, and then 2, if you could, explain what the heck he's saying.
He may not be in the best position.
I can read you his. He says. He quibbles with your definition of capital. You've read his.
Yeah, I've read it.
So he conflates Jamie says he conflates physical capital equipment with all forms of money-valued wealth, including land and housing, whether that wealth is in productive use or not. He excludes only what neoclassical economists call human capital, presumably because it can't be bought and sold. Then he estimates the market value of that wealth. His measure of capital is not physical, but financial. This, I fear, is a source of terrible confusion. For me...
Yeah. To be honest, I had a hard time understanding his point as well. I fully agree with James Galbraith that the market value of assets is only one way to count assets, and sometimes it very much differs from the social value of assets. So in the book, for instance, I give the examples of German corporations. Their market value is actually not that large, but still, the German corporations are working quite efficiently, and so, the fact that the market value for shareholders is lower because, partly because, workers have partial control on the company, which leads them to higher investment, human investment in the company, is certainly not bad at all for productivity. So the market value of assets is only, one measure of the value of asset, and certainly not the only one. So I fully agree with James Galbraith that the capital is multidimensional, and I try in the book to give justice to the fact that the history of real estate is not the history of business capital, it's not the history of public debt, it's not the history of land capital, of slave capital. All these different forms of assets have their own particular histories, their own valuation problem, and when you try to make the big sum of this by taking the market value of these different assets, you're doing something very abstract. And I'm certainly not trying to pretend that this is a correct summary of the state of capital in a given country. So, in the book, I am trying to give justice to this multidimensional nature of capital, and I'm really sorry if James Galbraith did not see that, but
And then Dean Baker was economist Dean Baker. He was critical of you. Two things. One, he cited China. He said that the rise of the working class in China drove down wages, and that you didn't account for that, and that will soon be fading, and there won't be a place to replace it. So therefore, wages ought to rise more. In his argument, and second, that you didn't focus enough on rents that come from patents and copyrights, and back to the super managers. Let's skip that since we already talked about that part.
No, I do talk a lot about China, and I try to take a global perspective on growth and wealth accumulation. And when I was saying before that the top of the wealth distribution at the world level is rising 3 times as fast as the world economy, well, this is taking China into account. So in spite of this huge growth coming from emerging countries, still the top of the world wealth distribution is rising faster than the average. So in other words, this R bigger than G logic is stronger than the convergence, the reduction in world inequality coming from China, at least at the very top end. And this per se, I think, is quite striking. Now, regarding patent law, I certainly agree that, reform in patent laws is a very important issue. But, I think this is complementary to progressive taxation of wealth. This is not a substitute. You cannot do everything with patent law. You cannot do everything with progressive taxation. So, I think we should not think of these different policies and institutions as sort of mutually exclusive from one another. There are, even if you have a perfect patent law, there's no reason, there's no natural force that should bring, the rate of return on large portfolio down to the growth rate.
Right.
It's very important to understand that there is, it will be an incredible coincidence, if the rate of return on large portfolio will coincide with the growth rate. There's no logical force, and certainly no evidence in history, but even from a purely logical viewpoint, there's really no reason why these two should be in line. So instead of waiting for this incredible coincidence to happen, if this happens, if growth increases so much because we make new innovation so fast and we all decide to have many children, much more than today, and the growth rate goes up to 5% everywhere in the world, and this is going to equilibrate the rate of return on capital, then fine. But, you know, just waiting for this incredible coincidence to happen does not strike me as a very reasonable bet. And I think all I'm saying in my book is that, you know, I don't know what the future of rate of return and growth rate will be in the world for the next century, but we should plan in advance to have institutions such as financial transparency and a wealth tax, so that at least we can make the corrections in case this incredible coincidence does not happen.
So
Alexis, one last question, Alexis?
Yeah, one last question. In your interview with The New Yorker, you mentioned that the English have too much blind faith in the markets that they don't always understand. And I was curious if you felt that that criticism was valid to countries other than England. I certainly think the United States is guilty of that, but curious what you think, how widely that criticism can be levied.
Oh, you know, I'm not nationalist with this respect. So I think it's a very broad criticism. You know, I think it applies to the US as well, but it also applies to Europe. You know, I think the entire world after the 1990 and, you know, particularly in the European Union, you know, began to construct a sort of unlimited faith in market competition. And, you know, in a way, the entire European Union is built around the idea that, you know, if you have free markets and perfect competition between European countries, then, you know, you have everything. And I think we are now starting to realize that, you know, a common currency without any common budget and common fiscal policy is a completely crazy institutional setup, and that, you know, this is not going to work. So, you know, either people will take back their monetary sovereignty, or, and I prefer the second option, we need to go to much deeper fiscal integration and a much deeper budgetary and political integration, at least within Eurozone country, and maybe Britain will come at some point later on, but, you know, as it will probably take a very long time. And the reason for this is that, you know, if we want to benefit from free markets and market integration, we also need fiscal institutions that make sure that the benefits from globalization are shared in a way that's acceptable to all. You know, otherwise, I think there's a serious risk that you know, growing fraction of the population will turn against globalization, or, for that matter, will turn against the European Union. And, you know, I come from a country where, you know, there are reasons to worry about these political forces.
They might. And what's next for you? You've written one of the seminal texts now in political economy. What do you do next?
Well, you know, I will write other books. You know, it's you know, it's only an introduction to an history of income and wealth. And
you spend the rest of your life doing version 2 and 3, or volume 2 and 3, like the last guy who wrote one.
Yeah, well, I have to think more about it, but certainly I will keep thinking about these issues.
The book is Capital in the 21st Century, written by Thomas Piketty, and this is HuffPost Live, where the conversation never stops.